Welcome to Democracy End, a new conversation series from WOLA featuring insider perspectives from those who lead. I'm Carolina Jiménez Sandoval from the Washington office on Latin America. In each episode, we sit down with leaders from across the Americas to explore what democracy means to them, the challenges it faces, and why it is so important. WOLA's work is made possible by listeners like you. If you value these conversations, please consider supporting us at wola.org/donate. Gracias.
In 2010, Laura Chinchilla made history as the first woman elected president of Costa Rica, a country long considered one of the hemisphere's most stable and enduring democracies, and one of only a handful of full democracies in the entire world. Her path to the presidency was shaped not only by her years as a scholar of security and justice, but by a deep conviction that democracy must deliver results without sacrificing the rule of law, a balance she navigated firsthand from the country's highest office. As democratic backsliding accelerates across Latin America, and as governments increasingly justify the erosion of rights in the name of security, her voice carries a particular weight. Costa Rica is no longer immune. In this episode, Carolina Jiménez Sandoval, WOLA's president, and Laura Dib, Venezuela program director and co-lead on WOLA's regional democracy work, sit down with President Chinchilla to ask, what does Costa Rica's model actually teach us about security without militarization, about governing democratically when the public's patience is running thin, and what does it mean when a beacon of democracy begins to flicker?
Thank you very much, President Laura Chinchilla, for joining us at WOLA, the Washington office on Latin America. I am Carolina Jiménez Sandoval, WOLA's president, and I am joined by Laura Dib, my colleague who leads the Venezuela program at WOLA and also co-leads our regional work on democracy. Nowadays, when we have so many threats to democracy and the rule of law, your voice is more needed than ever. Of course, you were the president of Costa Rica, a country that has been for so many years seen as a country, as one of the most stable democracies in the entire hemisphere. So we would love to hear from you, your experience about leading a country once considered a stable and plain democracy. What did it mean to govern democratically? What are the things that people do not often see? What are the difficulties that people who do not govern, the difficulties of leading democratically, that those of us who are not inside institutions do not appreciate?
Thank you very much, Carolina, for inviting me to participate in this podcast. Congratulations for the job you are doing at WOLA, raising your voices against all the different complex situations that democracy and human rights are experiencing right now in our region. So it is a pleasure to join you. As you mentioned, Costa Rica is a very robust democracy. It's the oldest uninterrupted democracy in Latin America, and it has also been a peaceful nation that has enjoyed political stability. According to the different democracy indexes, for example, our democracy is among the 3 full democracies in Latin America, along with Chile and Uruguay, and one of the 25 full democracies in the world. And it is precisely because of this exceptional status that the democratic erosion that our country is experiencing, and not many people know about that, and I will take a little time because it is in our interest also to let you know what is happening here. So that is why it is very concerning, the situation we are going through, because nobody, even us here in Costa Rica, were expecting to experience this situation, especially regarding press freedom and the systematic attacks on judges. Those are matters of concern right now. For example, Costa Rica's ranking in the World Press Freedom Index dropped significantly. In only 4 years, we moved from being among the 8 first positions at the top of the ranking in 2022 to number 30 in 2026. So this is something unprecedented. So connecting these comments, introductory comments I wanted to make with your question about the challenges of governing democratically in democracy. Of course, I will say that there are many challenges because precisely democracy is a very complex system. In authoritarian regimes, for example, the decision-making process is straightforward. The ruler simply gives orders. In contrast, democracy requires adhering to the Constitution, the laws, observing human rights, and considering the voices of the minority. So this makes the decision-making process much more intricate. But this is a big but. If democracy do not observe all of those rules, it means that it won't protect you against the abuses of power by authoritarian rulers. So I think, just to conclude this first question, I think that probably one of the major challenges that democratic leaders are confronting, and that was also a major challenge for me, is how to strike a balance between the need for democracy to deliver results faster and more efficiently, and the protection of the different mechanisms that guarantee checks and balances in the use of power. That's basically, I think, the major challenge that we are still confronting today.
Thank you, President Chinchilla. I'm going to take this last point you just mentioned, this to strike the balance between delivering results and respecting rights. When you ask Latin Americans what is their main concern, in most polling in the region, they say security. For decades, security, especially in the last few years, comes at the top of their concerns. Before you enter politics, you were a scholar of security. And for decades, Costa Rica was able to keep low levels of crimes and violence. So that's the first question. How was Costa Rica able to keep those low levels of crime and violence? And what has happened, and how can the country adapt to the current situation? And what, as a scholar, but also as a former president, what do you say to people who are demanding the mano dura policies, who are saying, we want the army in the streets, we want the militaries to take over citizen security because the police is no longer able to deliver security?
That is a very relevant question, and thank you for bringing that topic into our conversation. But to start, I would like to clarify that something that is very important when we speak about insecurity, which includes all types of crimes and especially criminal violence, and that is that this is a complex issue. It arises from multiple interconnected factors. And these factors include economic and social risk, as well as institutional weaknesses that hinder, for example, crime control or promote impunity. Therefore, in order to tackle crime effectively, we need to design policies based on a comprehensive approach, which usually must include, for example, economic, social, and community-based crime prevention programs that can address the root causes of crime. The other set of policies includes effective policing strategies so we can ensure the best possible control and investigation of illegal activities. And finally, something which is really critical in tackling crime and violence is promoting a robust rule of law and criminal justice system that can implement meaningful sanctions. So for many years, in the case of Costa Rica, we were very successful in addressing insecurity through a holistic approach, which included effective, inclusive access to social policies, especially education and health, alongside professional and independent law enforcement agencies. And then, as a result, we enjoyed for many decades one of the lowest homicide rates and one of the lowest impunity rates in Latin America. Very important is to also mention that we were able to achieve these results without an army, as you said, since we took a collective decisions more than 80 years ago to abolish it by constitution. So I will say at this point that it's a paradox when we see many people in Latin America mentioning that the military can be the solution to the security problem, because when we analyze the role of the armies, historically speaking, we can see that they were a factor of insecurity, repression, etc., rather than a factor of security. And this is why Costa Rica decided to abolish the army. And that is why also we were able to become one of the most stable, politically speaking, nations in our region. So yes, we need to recognize that bringing the armies into security functions without any kind of judicial controls is rather a menace for the citizens and not necessarily the solution. The same is happening with those very kind of easy responses that some rulers are intending in our countries, basically aimed at bringing more a sense of security in the populations, more trying to respond to the feeling of insecurity and not necessarily responding to the problem itself. When, for example, they basically are suggesting to incarcerate most of the people without due processes, when they are pretending to cancel the basic rights of the people as a mean to resolve the security problem. So they basically what they are doing is dismantling and debilitating the rule of law, and that is in the long run a big menace for our nations.
Good afternoon, President Chinchilla. My name is Laura Deep, and I'm the Venezuela Program Director. I think in your answers, you have pointed to some of the lessons learned from Costa Rica on how to fight crime within the rule of law and within that protection of democracy. And as we have said, Costa Rica has been a beacon for democracy in the region, which is very exceptional nowadays. However, we are seeing this alarming trend across the hemisphere in the erosion of checks and balances, especially, as you were mentioning, in the name of consolidating security and protecting safety. I think the state of exception in El Salvador is a very good example of that. So I was wondering if you could dive more into the diagnosis beyond Costa Rica, the diagnosis of the region. What is happening in the region in terms of justifying the erosion of the rule of law in the name of security?
Yes, it is true that criminal violence and organized crime are endemic problems in Latin America, and citizens feel a strong sense of insecurity, and that is justified. The problem is real and it is important, which means that governments must put an emphasis to this important issue and should prioritize it in their respective agendas. However, I am concerned, as you mentioned, that the most popular solutions being proposed by some governments are overly simplistic and often focus on marginalizing or dismantling the rule of law, implementing states of emergency without kind of temporary limits, and inviting the armies to intervene without the necessary judicial controls and procedures. So while these measures as I already said before, may be effective in the short run as they alleviate the feeling of insecurity in the population. They don't necessarily guarantee a sustained response over time and may have negative effects in terms of individual guarantees and the political rights of citizens. It is very clear that undermining the rule of law is like shooting yourself in the foot, because it usually leads to negative outcomes. In fact, the Global Organized Crime Index shows that Latin America has some of the lowest resilience to organized crimes, and this is largely due to the lack of professional and independent judicial systems. Let me use the example of El Salvador. That country claims success in reducing homicide rates, and that is correct, and we are very happy for that. But at the same time, it is ranking among the 5 countries in the region with the least resilience to organized crimes, below Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Suriname. And that is precisely because there is no rule of law in El Salvador. So again, probably it is good in terms of resolving some of the expressions of violence, of crime, especially, but when it comes especially to more sophisticated cases of crime like organized crime, the Salvadorian model is not a good model because it doesn't work. There is not a reliable administration of justice in that country. And it is not only a problem for tackling organized crime, like in this case, but it is also a problem, for example, economic growth, because attracting investment in a country with no clear rules is a very complex and difficult task.
President, you were earlier mentioning that security or achieving security was a very complex task because security was multifaceted in a way. And one very important platform during your administration was actually social security. And social investment was a very big and important part of your presidency. Nowadays, the idea of social security in many governments in the region is under attack. Social investment as a concept is under attack. We would love to hear how you feel about that idea. In your case, what were your priorities? What did you prioritize? And what were your successes? But what were also your failures, if there were any? What were the obstacles that you encountered? And how do you see these policies playing out in today's world, in the region these days? And if you still consider social investment as a necessary part of a security strategy?
Social investment is a necessary part, not only in terms of bringing more security to our nations, but also in terms of protecting democracy. It is almost impossible to convince people about being part of democratic society if you are not resolving the social problems they are experiencing. So social policy and social investment is something really critical, and especially education, for example, and health. When I needed to propose a policy for my country, because when I was elected President of Costa Rica, we were experiencing a crisis in security. Not the kind of crisis we are having today, because at that time we almost didn't have organized crime trying to penetrate our institutions. It was basically about common crime, but the homicide rates were on the rise. What we proposed was this approach to security based on what the UNDP has recommended as the human development approach, which basically includes not only, again, investing in professional police, trying also to strengthening the administration of justice, but something very important, investing in those most vulnerable communities and sectors. And let me give you some also very important information concerning the Latin American context. And that is that in our case, there are two very significant social issues which are very closely associated to the problem of crime. What has to do with inequality, and the second is the situation of our young population. In the case of inequality, it has been documented by several different studies that the greater the inequality distribution is in a country, inequality in the distribution of income and opportunities is in a country, the greater the levels of criminal violence also be. There is a coincidence we need to recognize in Latin America, which is a region with very high rates of inequality and at the same time with very high rates of crime. And in the case of the young population, the situation is quite disturbing because in Latin America and the Caribbean, young men are the primary victims of homicide, accounting for nearly 80% of all recorded homicides. Their vulnerability is seen just due to exposure to violence. They also face a high risk of recruitment by criminal groups. It is estimated that more than 50% of individuals suspected of intentional homicide and interacting with justice systems are under 29 years old. So this issue is very strongly connected to structural factors, because when we analyze the situation of the young population in Latin America, we can see that about 20 million young people are neither studying nor working, which basically means not giving them the social opportunities they deserve and they need in order to avoid the temptation to be part of the gangs and to be part of organized criminal gangs.
That is very interesting, especially considering from Venezuela the situation of migrants and refugees across the border with Colombia and how they're also so vulnerable to recruitment. But I wanted to move on to another topic, which is civic space. At WOLA, we think that civic space is absolutely crucial in order to hold public officials accountable. And we're watching civic space shrink country after country in the region. And you mentioned some of this in Costa Rica, which is very troubling, attacks to the press and the institutions of judiciary. But we're also seeing anti-NGO laws, limits on the right to protest. We wanted to ask you if you think that Costa Rica is also vulnerable to this trend of shrinking of the civic space, and what do you think that needs to be done in order to protect those vital spaces in the country before it's too late?
Thank you, Laura. As authoritarian populist forces rise in our region, as it is obviously happening in some countries, an urgent priority is to protect civil society and the spaces where individuals can fully exercise their civil rights. The tactics used to undermine civil society are often very subtle rather than overt. We cannot wait until it is too late, when the situation becomes as obvious as we see the police forces arresting people without due processes, or the prohibition of NGOs from receiving international cooperation, or the total banning of NGOs in some countries. And that is happening, for example, in Nicaragua, of course, Venezuela, but also we are seeing something of this happening in El Salvador. So again, we need to put attention since the beginning when those kind of subtle, very subtle actions are taking place. For example, here in Costa Rica, during the 4 past years, the president publicly targeted critics by revealing their phone numbers and addresses, sending a very clear message to others to think twice before speaking out or criticizing a government. Similarly, hostile actions were taken against media and journalists. So these attitudes have created an atmosphere here in Costa Rica where people are more silent, more cautious, are trying to avoid to speak out or using social media as they used to do in the past. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be in a country that traditionally used to be very open and speak out against the government. The governments. So this is why, again, we must strengthen and protect civil society organizations because organized civil society continues to be the last barrier against autocratic drift.
President, we're coming to a close, and before we go, some of our listeners include policymakers in Washington, people interested in security, Democrats, etc., but also young people who probably would like me to ask a couple of two questions that I would love to hear from you before we go. And one has to do, of course, with something that was very important for Costa Rica. I believe you were the first female president of your country. So we cannot let you go before asking, what did that mean to
Well,
you,
thank
to the
you.
country? What was the experience like?
Thank you, Carolina, for asking. Of course, number one, it was an honor. It was the honor of my life to not only to be elected president of a very robust democracy as Costa Rica has been, but also becoming the first female president in our Republican history. But at the same time, I need to recognize that it was very challenging because I experienced what is something very common with when women arrive for first time to a position that has traditionally been occupied by men. So when you are the first in any position, you have very challenges in terms of overcoming the social norms, those perceptions that traditionally have conditioned the way that people perceive how power behaves. And yes, I was elected and by many votes, I need to recognize, but it didn't mean that people already understood how a woman can deliver. And it was a constant battle with social media, with social media, but also traditional media, because they usually were covering me in a very different manner. They were more concerned about the way I was wearing, the way I was speaking, rather than my concrete actions, judging me by the concrete actions or decisions I was taking or making. So that was very challenging. However, I think that for the country, it was very important. And let me just share with you a very beautiful story. When I was elected president, here in Costa Rica, we organized a children's election. And that is something very special about Costa Rica. And I won not only the adults elections, but also the children's elections by a wider margin, which means that many children didn't obey their parents about who to vote for. So I decided to, also since my government was going to embrace many social policies in favor of children and young people, I decided to visit many schools and high schools before taking office. And so very soon after the elections, I visited some schools, and the teachers and professors told me something beautiful, and that was that the day after the elections, many girls arrived to the school saying that they were also going to be presidents of Costa Rica, which gave me a true dimension of how important my election was, because that meant I was able to break those glass ceilings that usually prevent many girls from dreaming about achieving something.
That sort of makes my second question a bit necessary, because I was going to ask you, what gives you hope in the middle of all these difficulties that your country is going through? And I wanted to let you know that we share your concern, President Chinchilla, about the democratic decline that Costa Rica is experiencing. And we want to also express our commitment to being there with the Costa Ricans as civil society and democratic fighters, ensure that we make the situation in Costa Rica visible for the international community. But in considering that, unfortunately, we have El Salvador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and now we see democratic decline in a country like Costa Rica. Sometimes it's hard to see of hope in a context like this. What gives you hope? What gives Laura Chinchilla hope?
Look, Carolina, when we analyze most of the reports on democracy, there is one variable, probably the only variable, that is not experiencing a deterioration among the different variables of democracy. Of course, the rule of law is experiencing deterioration, pluralism is experiencing deterioration, elections are experiencing deterioration, and many others. But the only one who is resisting this kind of declining is civil participation. Civil society is still mobilizing around the world. They are still organizing protests, different kind of initiatives, not only in order to do something about concerning issues such as climate change or digital technologies, but also in terms of confronting rulers in different parts of the world. So what truly gives me some hope amid this very complex situation we are experiencing with democracy is still the role of the people. And this is why I want to highlight once again how important it is to protect civil society. But it is not only a matter of protecting, it is also a matter of convincing those democratic leaders that we still have in some countries in our region that they need to do something in terms of promoting civic participation in the policy making, trying to open more spaces for that participation. Now we have the opportunity, for example, to introduce reforms for more kind of deliberative and participatory democracy. We have the great opportunity to use digital technologies to harnessing democracy. And that is the best possible way to also, at the same time, strengthening civil society, because we will give them more tools to participate, to be part of the decision-making process, and to enhance the role of civil society in democracy. So that is what gives me hope, and especially, very especially also, the role that many women in our region are still playing in protecting democracy and in confronting those extreme scenarios of democratic deterioration.
I'm feeling very hopeful right now, President Chinchilla. So
it's very hard.
It's been an incredible honor, and it's been a pleasure having you here in our podcast, Democracy End. So thank you very much for your time and for joining us today.
No, thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you for the continued job that you are doing in protecting human rights and democracy. Thank you very much, Carolina.
Thank you,
Laura.
President.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Take care.
Democracy and security reminds us that a strong democracy requires more than elections. It demands institutions built to last, and the courage to protect them even when shortcuts are tempting. President Chinchilla's journey from security scholar to Costa Rica's first female president is a measure of progress that has been made, but also shows how much the region still has to defend. Her reflections on security without militarization, the erosion of civic space, and the resilience of civil society offer an essential perspective for anyone who believes that democracy must uphold the rule of law to survive it all. And amid so much deterioration, she points to one thing that is holding: people. Civil society is still mobilizing, women across the region are still fighting, and that, she says, is reason enough to keep going.